Let's use a 3D asset in our 2D comp. Some of you have asked how I incorporate 3D elements into my 2D graphics. And when I posted my Happy New Year graphic that I created for the NBA, I got a lot of questions about how I made it. So I figured this is a great opportunity to bring those two things together and show you how I made this graphic, while also showcasing how I incorporate a very simple 3D asset into After Effects in my 2D workflow. If you'd like to follow along and create something similar for yourself, you'll need to have access to Cinema 4D. You'll also need to download Pastiche 2 from aescripts.com. I use Pastiche to help me animate the basketballs to form the words. So let's quickly talk about the brief that I received from the NBA. It needs to say Happy New Year with the NBA logo at the end. The text should be made out of basketballs, and it needs to represent all 30 NBA teams. Now, this is a pretty simple and straightforward brief and gave me some flexibility to create as I saw fit. In order to make this happen, I didn't want to make 30 different renders out of Cinema 4D to create all these different colors for the basketballs. So although I made a couple different renders, I wanted to streamline this so that I could have maximum flexibility within After Effects. So let's jump into Cinema 4D and see how I did it. Cinema 4D has a few sports items, so that's what I'm going to use. Go up to Window and Asset Browser, and it's going to populate here on the side. And if I go down to Objects and twirl that open and come down to Sports Items, I have a couple different options here. So I'm just going to click and drag and drop the basketball into my scene, and it's going to load right in the middle. All right, so I can go ahead and close this manager, and I have what I want. If I hit 2, I can zoom in. All right, so I want to be totally squared up on this ball. So let's go ahead and add a camera real quick and make that active. And then if we also go and add a null in the middle of our scene, and in camera, if we do tags, animation tag, target, and drag null down into our target object, that is going to put us right in the middle. So now if I spin around this, it's going to spin around the null. And that looks pretty good right about there. So I'm going to zoom in because I want this as large in my scene as possible. So let's go ahead and go into settings. I think I am going to just output this as 720. Okay, so that's good. I'll turn that back off. All right, so I have my basketball, but it's orange. And because I want to change the color on this to represent all the different teams, I actually want to change this to white. So if we go up here to Window, and I come down here to my Material Manager. All right, so if I select my base material, and I come down here to my color, I'm just going to move it all the way so that I have a white. And that's all I'm going to do with that. I want to make it white because within After Effects, I'm going to put a tint on this so that blacks are black, and then the white is going to change to whatever team color I select. All right, and then I'm going to select my basketball because I want this to rotate. So if I go into my coordinates, have my CTI here at the very beginning. If I just turn on all of these keyframes, and then we go to the very end, I'm going to make these go complete 360, and I click and drag to select them all. So now we have a spinning basketball. I actually don't want one of these to go to 360. We'll change this to 180 because it looks kind of funky when it does that spin. I think that's going to work just fine. All right, and then the other thing that I did was, if I go up in here into my F curve, let's pull this over here. If I hit H to fit, you can see there's automatic easing here. And since I want this to continuously move. I'm just going to change those to linear keyframes. So now when I go back, it's just going to, I think I'm just going to get rid of this keyframe altogether. Turn that off and turn this one off. Let's see if that plays back better. There we go. I just wanted to spinning basketball, so we're better off just leaving that at 0. So now I have this spinning basketball, and I have it set up so that I can change the white color from my tint within After Effects. And I am ready to render. So go up here. I actually just used the standard renderer for this because there's not much going on. It was fairly quick. And you can set this to OpenEXR or PNG, whatever you want. Just make sure that there is an alpha channel on it. And you can just save a compositing project file. Give this a name and go ahead and render it. All right, so I'm in my final comp here. I'm just going to turn all these off. So I'm in my final comp here in After Effects, and this is the full rotation loop that I exported from Cinema 4D. And the way that I colored this, because remember, my intention was to make this feel like it represents all 30 teams in the league. So I added a levels here to punch up a little bit of the whites and push the darks back a little bit. I just did a slight adjustment here. And then for my tint, I actually, if I hit U, I actually went in frame by frame and changed my tint, my white. I just set a keyframe on the map to white, and I changed that with every frame so that it just bounced and represented a different team color. And I didn't do anything with the black because I wanted the black to remain the black, and that way you could still see some of the textures. Like here, if I duplicate this, and let me turn off. Let me just go to the middle here. Since the ball is spinning itself, and I rendered this as large as I wanted it, I just went in and added a little bit of scale up here. Since my ball's already spinning, I don't have to worry about adjusting the rotation or anything so that the ball appeared to be flying up in the air. All right, so that's the initial element here that I went with. And out of Cinema 4D, I also rendered a couple different versions of this ball. Let me open up those versions. So I did just an H rotation, which, let me turn off these expressions real quick, which just rotates around the center here. And I did it for the H, P, and Z rotations. But in my final render, I didn't actually feel like you could really see it that well, and didn't really feel like it was necessary. All right, so you can see that they're all rotating and are facing different ways. So that was a little detail thing that I'm not sure mattered at the end. Now that we were in Cinema 4D and I showed you how to rotate, I think you can figure that out. I just set keyframes at the front and back and just use one of the rotation properties for those. All right, so you can see I turned off these expressions when we were in here. So I wanted the end result to have a little bit of a wiggle to it. So although I'm using Pastiche to bring the balls together to form a word, I wanted to have a little bit of wiggle when it settled. So when I imported these, I put a posterized time and a random with a little bit of a wiggle on there, so there's the X version. It's just kind of going side to side, and then I did it on the Y too. So that gives it a little bit of extra movement, but it's super subtle. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Pastiche. And I'm going to go up here. You can see I had a number of different comps here, and they're basically just iterations on each other because I was playing around trying to figure out what I liked and how things work. So in this first one, the way Pastiche works is you need a source layer. So my source layer here is text that I created directly within After Effects. So I wanted this to say Happy New Year, and then the logo. Let me just make that black so that you can see this better. All right, and I set everything to 1 second because I wanted to keep this kind of short and keep it moving. So that was my primary source. And the way Pastiche works is you have a source, which is my text, and you add the pastiche effect to your source. And I ended up pre-rendering the 3 different versions that I had for the H rotation, the P rotation, and the Z rotation. So all of these layers represent a ball. Let me turn this off. So each one of these layers, you can see this ball is represented right here. And for Pastiche to look good, you really need a ton of layers. Let me go down. So I had 720 layers here that represent and make up the text. So I took the pre-rendered balls and duplicated them a ton of times. All right. And within my source here, I used grid, and I left it on grid the whole time. So it just kind of morphs from here to here to here. And that looked okay. It was a decent first step. I didn't like how things ended up looking. A little step here, a little bit harder to read. So I decided I wanted to play around with some of these different settings. So let me open up a different pastiche layer. All right, so I still have the same number here. And on my source, I put this at organic, which was a little bit nicer for what I was trying to accomplish. You know, there's some bulkiness in different areas, and it kind of separated the balls out just a little bit more. And they morphed from text to text. All right, so in 3, my source here was organic, but I had it pull from luminance here, the scale. And you can see as you get to the logo, some of the balls are pretty small, some of them are bigger. And the NBA doesn't really come through here as well. I mean, you could still kind of make it out, but probably more from recognition of knowing the logo than necessarily how things look here. I thought that was okay, but I still wanted to push it a little bit further. This is when I started to play around. I duplicated my source and named this source 2. So let's jump in here. And the primary difference with this source is that I decided I wanted to play around with some of the text effectors, see if I could double up the movement a little bit and make it feel a little bit different. And by doing that, that's what generated this ball look initially, because things are coming on differently. So I have this set to organic, and my scale is from alpha. And I played around with the scale options in here. So you can see minimum size pixels 0, maximum is 50. And I also have this under scale options here. I also have this set to prevent overlap, because I didn't want the balls to overlap each other. And while I was playing with the source 2 here, I also wanted to play with the spatial interpolation. So elastic has more springiness, and I set that to 50. Basically just means that it's not going to totally settle right away. So when it comes into form, there's a little bit of easing. All right, so let's now go to 5. So in the last one, I had played with the text, right? So I still have my source 2 here, but the thing that I started to do in this version, was play with the position and scale so that I didn't have the same kind of formations happening. So I started with grid, and at 1 second, I had it go to organic, and then I did stippling, Luma, and the scale is from neighborhood when I started with random initially. All right, and then when I got to here, I did organic from neighborhood. And then for the last one here, I did organic from luminance because I wanted it to pull, the logo outline here is white, and I wanted it to pull just from the luminance here. But you can see it made the NBA really not legible. So what I ended up doing, so now we're jumping into 7 here. And this is basically just a duplicate of 5, except for the fact that I added tint to each basketball, and I did this bulk. I created all 30, and then I duplicated the sets of 30 so that I wouldn't have to go into every single asset and change the color manually. So now that I've added some color to these, I liked how things were coming on. I liked the color variations here, and I liked how changing up the different positions allowed it to feel smooth while also providing some variety. And within this source, you'll notice it says no NBA text. So because the NBA here was not really that great, wasn't able to read it, I decided to just get rid of that for this one, and I would create one by itself. So you can see there's one here called Pastiche NBA, and if I double click on that, this is the NBA text only. So it allowed me to drive all the basketballs from before, and I only used it for this last piece. But I still created a whole comp for it because the basketballs needed to seem like they were coming together to form the NBA. And that allowed me to make this much more legible in my final asset here. Let me click on the final one. So you can see I have the NBA here. So let's click in this. Turn that one on. All right. So all the balls came together to make up the logo, and then I just added a new layer here for NBA, just so that you could actually read that it said NBA here. And albeit the balls are smaller here, but I inserted it in a way that made it feel like it was still coming from and part of the scene, even though it's a separate comp. All right, so let me turn on the background here. Let me RAM preview this so we can see what it all looks like. That's looking pretty good and is definitely in the direction that I wanted to go. It still doesn't really feel New Year's Eve, though. It's definitely basketball. It's definitely colors. It definitely represents all the different teams in the league. But I needed to push this a little bit further. So that's where I went back to Pastiche 5. And if I open that one back up, you can see that I actually used a little bit smaller. So I actually adjusted the scale here. And if I'm in 7, let me go here. You can see that the basketballs are 2.3%. And in here, I adjusted the scale to be even smaller so that basketballs don't take up as much space. And what that allowed me to do, if I go to my final comp here, that way I had a little bit of layering here within my final comp, and the smaller basketballs are going to fill in a little bit more of the space, so it allows for more depth and volume within my text. All right, so those are a little bit smaller, and then I also wanted to add a little bit more depth, and so I again duplicated Pastiche, but instead of using the basketballs, I actually used the logos. Let's go into 6. So I brought in all the different logos for every team and did the same thing. I dropped all 30 on the timeline and then duplicated in sets of 30 that allowed me to get all 450 layers here. They're all spread out and separated different ways. Small, large, and they're filling the space. And again, use source 2. So I ended up using these logos as my background. All right. And I threw a fast box blur of 1 on the logos just to help push them into the background a little bit more and give some separation from the basketball so they stood out. So if I would have had them without the blur, they're pretty clear. So you can see just you can see the amount, just a slight blur here pushes them into the background a little bit. And then if I hit T, I drop my opacity on these down to 15 to, again, help push them into the background. You don't want to see them. They're supporting documentation, so to speak, for what we're looking at here with the new. So since we were going into 2023, I also added some light text here in the background. Here we go. Just ever so faint, 2023, copied, repeated. And I have a leak. This is from Sapphire, Force Effects Sapphire, light leak. And this is just giving me a little bit of light in the foreground that's on top of my logos and the text so that it pushes those, again, even a little bit further into the background. So let's go up here and add the star glow. And you can see it's really giving life to that Pastiche 5 that we created here. So if I double click into here, I left all these balls white, and since I didn't color them, the star glow is picking up. I have the input channel to lightness, so it's picking up the white balls more than the colored ones, and is amplifying those, and that's what's giving it that light look. Go forward a little bit in time here so you can see when it's laid out here. There we go. So you can see that those lights, those white balls in the background, although they're smaller, they're given a little bit more volume from the star glow. All right, and the other thing I did here, if I hit U, is so these Pastiche are all connected to this null, and I adjusted the scaling with the null because I wanted it to feel like the screen was filled the whole time. So happy is wider than new, so I wanted it to feel like you were getting pushed into new, and then pulled back just a little bit for year, and then even more for the logo, because the logo is very vertical and the other pieces are more horizontal. So just that little extra amount of push in, pull back, along with the pastiche elements the basketball is animating into and forming a new word, kind of gives it a transitional look and feel while keeping the scene active as it evolves. So let me go ahead and just ramp preview this. So now you can really see how the scaling here, pushing as I'm pushing in while this is forming new, and then I pull back a little bit for year, and then we really pull back, but I let it start to happen first before I pull back. So if I go into my curve here, you can see that I really pull this as far as I can, so that when it forms, it kind of goes along with the curves here. Wait, and then it pushes in. And you can see how all the different pieces layer together to make a nice looking comp. If I turn off my leak, you see just how that hint and the movement gives it a little bit more life. And I also added this light here. So in order to reinforce this hit, so the ball comes up, and as it's coming down, I want to reinforce this impact. So the ball disappears, and the way that I do that is with the light burst here. It's a lens flare, and it just blows out the middle there. So if I play that back now, you can see that introduces it draws your attention and introduces happy as it expands out. So that was a quick rundown of some of the decisions that I made as I built this New Year's Eve asset for